Sorry, I was just taking a bit of a nap down there. Today we're going to look at what's a rather gruesome game, and it's probably going to leave me sounding rather psychopathic. Today we are going to have a look at Abomination by Plaid Games. Okay, so what is Abomination? Well, it's a worker placement game, so probably the most famous of those types is probably Lords of Waterdeep, where players will have a number of workers on their board, and then they will place them across the board, carrying out different actions as the game goes on, all the while trying to beat the police captain who's currently advancing his investigation. So, what exactly is he investigating? Well, in Frankenstein style, you're trying to create a monster that you're trying to bring to life in Frankenstein fashion. You have to do this before the police captain catches on, although you will have character cards who usually have different abilities on them. However, there will be one that may possibly be trying to progress the captain all the way through to the end. Now, one thing about Plaid Hat, and probably the most immediately striking thing about this game, is its theme. And what I mean by Plaid Hat is they seem to be the masters of theme. Not only is this game littered with quotes from Frankenstein on it, on the back of player boards, on the back of other pieces, the game even comes with a letter addressed to you explaining a little bit more about the game. Another thing that's really thematic about this game is, unlike other worker placement games, this one kind of has a running narrative where events are going to happen, like storms, or there's even a space on the board called the public square where executions take place, which will only trigger after certain things happen. You see, there are these event cards and an event deck which has different events and encounters, which are basically two-sided, so it depends how far in the game you are, what round you're on, as to what event actually takes place. Also, you'll be finding in some of these encounters, you actually have within the rulebook kind of more bits of dialogue and choices that people will be making to kind of create its own little story around it, which is absolutely fantastic. Carrying on with the theme as well, it just all works together really, really well. You see, you're going to be wanting to gain body parts over the course of the game. You'll want the freshest body parts. Like I said, this is all going to make us sound really, really psychotic, but you have a choice of how you get your bodies. Are you going to go to the cemetery and dig up some graves in order to get more skeletal remains? Are you going to go to the morgue where you've kind of got bodies that have already been treated, but take them and they have kind of fresher body parts to them? You can even go directly to the hospital and just pick up the bodies that are currently there to identify cause of death and things like that. So they're really, really fresh. Those body parts are going to do really well. Or you can get really, really fresh stuff if you decide to either go to the docks to hire some scoundrels to basically attain bodies through various different methods that you don't need to know about, or you can get your hands really dirty and just murder someone yourself. It's all really thematically brilliant because these things move fairly quickly. So the bodies that are in the hospital will only be there for one round, after which they're replaced by other bodies. The whole idea is they've probably gone to the morgue by this point. So, and the executions in the public square, those bodies will only be there for one round. It's a really nice way of kind of being able to do this. There's also a slaughterhouse where you can get animal parts, but they're going to affect your score. You see, if you build a corpse out of really, really fresh body parts, you're going to be scoring more. If you're going to be putting animal parts in there, it's going to affect how well you do over the course of the game. Okay, so other than that, you have other things you can do in the game which all work quite well. There's an academy where you can go and you can get research cards, which are going to either give you special abilities throughout the game, or they can affect your dice rolls when you're trying to bring your body parts to life later on in the game. You also have places like at the hospital. It's not just there to gain bodies, fresh bodies. You can also go to work there, or you can volunteer. You also have a church where you can go and atone. You see, on your player boards, you have different dials. One for humanity, one for reputation, and one for expertise. Your expertise is basically how much you understand about putting a body together. So as you build your expertise, you can do things like build a head rather than just an arm or a leg, which are generally regarded as being simpler. Your reputation is pretty much governed by your humanity, although there are other ways of raising it as well. The more you raise your reputation, the more that you'll be able to hire. For example, you'll start off the game with 1 scientist and 2 workers, and they will develop into more scientists and more workers, and the more you've got, the more actions you can take during each round. You see, in worker placement games, you're limited by how many people you've got in order to be able to place on the actual board. Now, it's kind of clever because a lot of these actions you'll be taking, for example, when you go to the morgue, sometimes you'll have probably a body that's a little too fresh. Therefore, in order to experiment on it, you may have to sacrifice some of your humanity. You may have to do this for other things, for example, hiring scoundrels at the docks. That's also going to affect your humanity. And the more your humanity gets affected and the lower that gets, the lower your reputation gets. And the lower your reputation gets, the less people will want to actually work for you. It all ties together really, really well thematically. So what happens if your humanity has dropped a little too low? How do you get it back? Well, like I said before, you can volunteer, or there's a church where you can atone. A lot of these actions will do things like aid the captain, so it's kind of sometimes a bit of a hard choice to make, because the captain, you may be advancing quicker across the map and giving you less time to actually be able to raise your monster. So, in terms of worker placement games, so far it's got a few extra little story elements to it and things of the sort. However, it's kind of a bit samey, so what else is new? Well, for a start, the first player marker. Oh, you say? Well, having the first player marker is usually quite important in any worker placement game. Well, in this one, having the first player marker also gives you one little extra benefit, and that is that you actually get to take 1 extra turn at the end of the round. So the first player marker actually counts as an extra meeple in this case, which gives you a few extra added benefits and means that everyone is probably going to want to be that first player just to get 1 extra turn in over everybody else. And as for other things, okay, so you've got bonus goals. Great, so everyone's going to be aiming to do different things at different times, because they will be things like the first person to reach 10 humanity or something along the lines of that. You usually have 4 of those drawn at the beginning of the game, and they kind of allow the game to be played a little bit differently every time. People will be trying to do different things at the beginning. I mean, all of that at the moment just seems like little variations on things you can already do in other games. However, this game also includes something else, a thing called bumping. And what it is if someone else has taken an action that you want to take, you, for a price, can bump them from the space and take the action yourself. The cost for this is giving them either 1 or 2 gold, which is a nice little touch, and there's nothing they can do about it. They have to accept the gold and just give you the action. So it kind of helps with blocking and stuff like that. However, you are limited, depending on the number of players, the amount of time someone can block during a single game. So none of this really seems to be kind of giving too much new. They're just little twists on things. However, what you have got is your own player board, which has a number of private actions that you can do yourself, things that no one else can take from you, so you can always do. You can practice to raise your expertise that little bit more, just in case you're struggling to get those, or that knowledge, to be able to build the next body part. You can give blood, which you probably won't be doing at the beginning of the game, but towards the end of the game, blood becomes really, really important, and I'll explain why now. You have these references. Every single player has one, where you can start a monster part. These tend to involve getting bone, organs, and muscle tissue, things like that, to be able to string together. But it's only in the second part, because building it isn't enough. You then have to complete it, which is when you need your blood and some more organ parts and some more muscle tissue in order to actually finish out the body part. only when you've gone through these different phases. This all happens on your board just here. So over the course of the game, you're going to be placing body parts and then putting skin onto them. Good God, I sound like a maniac right now. And you will only be able to actually start making these body parts alive once you've actually built it, if I put them all in the right place here. So how do you build them? Again, that's all tracked on this little player board, and this is what actually makes this game a little more unique compared to other ones. What you'll be doing is, you'll be getting your different body parts, your organs and your muscle tissue and things like that. And depending on the freshness of the body, they'll all be going into different slots within here. And at the end of the round, they all degrade. You can stop it by doing things like buying ice, which you can actually place in there, and you can flip that over to its used side in order to stop it all moving down this track. You see, when it moves down the track, they discard off the end of there. So everything will be going down over time. Your blood actually discards after part 2 of the degradation track. If it flips off of there, then hey, it goes away and you need to get it again. So blood becomes a really important part, especially towards the end of the game. You really want to be keeping an eye on this and buying ice so that you can plan ahead better. Because once that's gone, it all starts degrading again. Your bones are actually kept in a separate spot down there. And only once you've done all this and built all this do you actually try to bring your monster to life. This is where you actually will be rolling some dice. So what you want is you want these Leyden jars, which originally start off empty. Sometimes you can get lucky and there's a weather effect which will actually flip all of the ones that you've currently got installed over to their electrified side. Otherwise, you can do it manually on a private action on your board to be able to flip over more of them. So what do? Well, for every one that you have lit up, you're able to roll 2 grey dice. Should your expertise be high enough, you can exchange one of those grey dice for a blue dice, maybe even 2. And what you'll do is, for every one of these, you get to roll 2 dice and try and bring your monster to life. You do this by rolling these little eye icons here, which allow you to, like I say, bring them to life. However, for every electrical bolt that you roll, you have to deal damage to your monster. So simply having it built isn't good enough. You place 1 on each of the body parts, because if you get a second one on there, you have to flip it down to its other side. If it's on the muscular side, and you get 2, you have to discard it altogether. Also, previous body parts that were alive before, if they get 2 damage markers on them, they're dead. And you have to build them again. But you do score the points for them again, which will work really quite nicely for you, so it's not all doom and gloom. So, all of this sounds great. I mean, it maintains the core essence of what a worker placement game is, whilst offering additional story elements to the game. You get your own player boards, which allow you to do little extra things that you can't usually do in worker placement games. This is all great, right? So, okay. First thing that I really want to say is there are just too many options in this game. Sure, the ones on your individual player boards are not necessarily the best actions you can take on your turn, and a lot of what you really need is actually on the board. However, there's an awful lot of spaces in this game, and even if everyone manages to unlock every single one of their scientists and every single one of their workers, to which you've got a maximum of 4, I believe. Yeah, 4. You actually find you have plenty of space and plenty to do in this game. You never have that whole thing you usually feel in worker placement games where everything feels claustrophobic and everything seems really, really important. It's not the end of the world if you're the first player. Sure, being the first player gives you an advantage, but you never really feel desperate in this game compared to other worker placement games. Where, for example, in Lords of Waterdeep, for example, the board gets very claustrophobic very, very quickly. However, you build buildings around the side, and if you build a building, then people have to give you stuff. Yes, this has got that bump action here where you have to give another player coins and stuff like that, but it kind of feels like in Lords of Waterdeep, it's a much harder decision to go to one of those buildings in order to take an extra action rather than give someone a couple of coins for simply using the space they've already taken. Plus also, you tend to find a lot of those bump mechanics. You see, if you decide to bump your own person, you can do it for free. So most of those bump actions are actually taken in order to bump your own player off the board so you can do the same action twice. I was doing this all the time in the hospital. If I was the first player, I was taking the first few bodies from the hospital and then bumping them and taking even more towards the end of the game and doing some crazy stuff with that. It's just, there's too much here, especially if someone ends up being this guy just here. Baptiste Rousseau is a psychopath. The psychopath doesn't lose nor gain any humanity at all over the course of the entire game. Why is this important? It means he can just murder people without too many consequences. Yes, there's a mechanic in the game where you get a little police marker if you ever commit a murder, and if you get 2 of those you can't murder again unless you pay the police off, which costs 3 francs. But at the same time, the real put-off is the fact that you lose 3 humanity through murdering people. Also, hiring people from the docks often loses you huge amounts of humanity. You lose too much humanity, you lose your reputation. And if you lose your reputation, you lose people that can go around and work for you on the board. The psychopath just avoids that and can just murder at will. It's really overpowered, and you often find that the rest of the group kind of have to gang up on him in order to stop him from just running away with building his monstrosity. Another thing that we came across is the horrific amount of board space this takes up. The actual player board isn't that big, but the amount of resources you have to spread around the board is quite huge. On top of that, every individual player has these big boards which obviously have to hold 3 dials at the bottom, as well as space for creating your monster and storing cubes and stuff like that. You also all have to have this reference card piece. You absolutely have to, because this contains really quite in-depth information about how many expertise you need in order to build a certain body part, or the amount of organs that it takes in order to build that body part, on top of how many victory points you get, as well as any negatives as well that you may gain. Also, it's double-sided, so after you've built a monster part, you've got all the information for attaching the skin to it on the other side. God, there's no way of explaining this game without sounding like there is something really, really wrong with you. On top of that as well, you also have your character card, which you have to have nearby, because not only does it have your character's ability on it, it also has your slots for actually storing your workers, of which you start off with 2 workers and a scientist at the beginning of the game. So this is all vital stuff, and I mean, we have a big table here, and it's absolutely filled. I feel like if you had a 5th player in this game, there just would not be room for it. Luckily, this is a 1 to 4 player game, so you can just about fit everything, even on a large table like this. Finally, the last thing I really want to draw attention to is that as a 2-player game, this is just bad. I mean, they have these little boards that mean you've got less bump spaces if you've got fewer players, but the board still feels way too open as a 2-player game. There's still way too many options and places you can go to without feeling like you're really pressed to be the first player. The other problem, and it does actually address this in the book, it says there are a couple of characters you should not play as in the 2-player game for your first few games. I would argue you never play with these 2 people. The obvious one is the psychopath, which I've talked about earlier. The other one I want to talk about is the humanitarian. And the reason why is because a lot of her game involves being good and going to the only 2 places on the board which actually gain you humanity, which is the church and volunteering at the hospital. Now, you can, if you're good, actually manage to play it properly and build a monster. However, that's not really taking advantage of her abilities, which is basically to get as much humanity as possible and then push the captain as far along the track as quickly as possible and end the game quickly. Now, it just doesn't make sense. You see, if there's only 2 real spots on the board that can really help this character, it means in a 2-player game it's relatively easy to close her out, which really makes the two-player variant almost impossible. They really needed to do more with this to accommodate 2 players, or just make it a 3 to 4 player game. If you're looking for a 2-player worker placement experience, this definitely isn't it. So that really brings me on to the end of the game and what we actually think about this game. Honestly, I really like it. Is it the best worker placement game you can buy? Not even close. In fact, I would say there's been worker placement games released this year alone that are better than this. I look at things like Gugong or Underwater Cities. Do you know what? If you're talking about a claustrophobic worker placement game, look no further than Underwater Cities, because you run out of actions really quickly on that. I haven't even played the game. However, I have learnt it and kind of played around with it a little bit, and I can see how it just closes itself out very quickly. I mean, Teotihuacan is a worker placement game to a point, a bit of a more creative one. Again, I would probably recommend that over this. And even something like Come On Games' Victorian Masterminds, which I don't even think is really a worker placement game. However, it kind of has a unique kind of twist on it, where your pieces actually do something rather than the actual locations you're putting things into. I mean, there's a lot I love about this game. Like I said, the actual aesthetics of the game, the theme of the game and how they use it is absolutely brilliant. But hey, Plaid Hat, I don't know if they look for certain things or whether they advise their designers over ways they can improve them in order to tie things together, but every single Plaid Hat game I play seems to have its own little universe contained within a game that all just sews itself nicely together. So I cannot fault the theming of this game, as much as I also think it's probably going to disturb a lot of you. And if this is the kind of thing that would normally disturb you, I imagine you haven't made it this far into this review anyway. Apart from that, I mean, I can definitely see myself playing this again, because I do like the theming to it, and it is generally another worker placement game, and I'm always after some of those because I actually quite enjoy them. But yeah, apart from that, I think all that's left to say is thank you to our patrons who voted for this game for the month. If you would like to help vote on what game we review every month, you can do for as little as $1 a month at Patreon by going to patreon.com/everybodydice. If you'd like to follow our social medias, you can find us on Instagram at everybodydiceshow or on Twitter at everybodydice. You can also find all of our stuff in one place on everybodydice.com. Apart from that, please like, share, subscribe. We really depend on stuff like that. It really helps us. We're currently way under our target for subscribers for the year. So if you can just tell your friends that have an interest in board game about this site, then that would really help us. Apart from that, we will probably see you with another review next year. So Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all of that stuff. Thanks very much for watching. Bye!